Section 1. 27,000 feet, shrapnel, and a ship that wouldn't die, April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The sky is a whitewashed bowl of thin cloud. The sun glares off the aluminum skin of a B-17 flying fortress and turns its rivets into a string of pinprick stars. Inside, the air tastes of oil and hot metal and the faint metallic tang of fear. Captain Robert Harlan sits hunched at the Thompson yoke, his jaw a hard line beneath the sweat-dark shadow of his pilot's cap. Beside him, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz scans the horizon with the practiced gaze of a man who has learned to find danger in every curve of cloud. The fortress around them is not a palace. It is a cathedral of noise. The four Wright R-1820 engines hum like angry bees, vibrating through a frame that creaks and flexes with every gust. The radio sputters Morse code stress that crackles at the back of the flight deck. Flak reported, flak heavy, break formation. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Reed, clutches the Norden bomb site like a talisman. Down below, the river slicing through Bremen reflects a city that does not know this aircraft by name. To them, it is simply a thundercloud falling from the sky. They are 10 minutes out from the target when the first bang comes. Not the leisurely bloom of distant flak, but a savage punch that jars every bone in the fuselage. The B-17 shudders, a piece of the starboard wing goes quiet. The intercom fills with clipped, practical voices, every syllable a prayer turned into procedure. "Port waist hit," crackles the tail gunner, Tech Sergeant Frank Miller, his words swallowed in static. "Hydraulic pressure dropping," the flight engineer reports, and that line trails off as if cut by the same thing that threatens them. A starburst of metal that rips through sheet and bone alike. You feel the aircraft as a living thing. You feel it shiver and then settle. Captain Harlan's fingers find the controls, small, precise adjustments to coax the wounded bird back into the sky. The collective breath of the crew is a held thing, each man a gear in a machine whose only job is to keep them together. Through the open waist window, a gust tears papers. A map unfurls like a wounded flag. Bullets punch ragged holes through the fuselage, and the electrician's panel glows with thin, living lines of flame. Yet the flying fortress keeps flying. This is not a miracle. It is the accumulated stubbornness of design, redundant fuel lines that isolate damage, multiple control runs, so a snapped cable does not equal a snapped fate, engines that keep spinning even when the airframe is half moth-eaten. The radio operator, Corporal James Mac McKenna, voices the impossible in the only way a man can when he's too busy being heroic to be rhetorical. "She's holding together, sir. She's holding together." There is a rasp of laugh that might be hysteria, might be relief, might be gratitude. Fire erupts in the forward bomb bay, a gout of flame licking at canvas and wiring. The pilot's face, a map of lines and decisions, never leaves his instruments. Lieutenant Ortiz jams the throttles forward on the left two engines to compensate for the loss on the starboard wing, and the B-17 lists stubbornly, like a boxer feeling a blow and coming back up. The waist gunners keep pouring lead into a sky already filled with orange blossoms of flak. The tail gunner's .50 caliber does its job, chewing air and making space where there had been none. Through the razor-slit viewports, the crew watches the city approach and then fall away. A collage of roofs and chimneys, smoke like small clouds rising from it. The navigator, a quiet middle-aged man named Harold Jensen, works by dead reckoning and a torn chart that flaps like a wounded bird in his lap. He calls each heading with the steady certainty of a man who knows his life is tied to degrees and minutes. "West by north, 350, he says. The radio squawks, a voice like a stone being thrown into a well. "Enemy fighters reported at 10 o'clock low." Another ripple of tension moves through the fuselage. The fortress eats it and keeps climbing. Inside, under panels, in the ribs and spars, are the choices that will decide whether they make it home. Not just rivets and rivets counters, but deliberate redundancies. Main tanks partitioned in such a way that a single puncture does not mean a single death. Control cables routed in triplicate. Electrical systems split so that a single fire cannot take the instruments that mean life. A dozen small decisions made months before by engineers with rulers and slide rules now stand between these men and the cold of the German sky. Captain Harlan glances aft at the crew through the headset's thin glass. Faces are lit by the orange of burning panel and the green of instrument lamps. He speaks slowly, each syllable chosen to steady rather than to instruct. "Older boys, we keep her steady and we keep our heads." There is a husk of a cheer that rides the intercom, harder than bravado, softer than prayer. The fortress answers them with metal and persistence. A wing that should have folded under the assault keeps holding its shape because the engineers anticipated the kind of violence war would mete out. The fuel that should have poured out in a gusher instead beads and seals itself away from the iron throat of flame. Resilience, not luck, sustains them. They turn for home on 3 engines, wounded but uncompromised in spirit. Below, the German flak crews reload and prepare to spit out another storm. Above, the sky is indifferent. Inside, for this handful of men and the aluminum frame that cradles them, there is a narrative being written in metal, a story of how design choices become the difference between death and dinner at a mess hall back in England. But none of that is spoken. For now, there is only the work of living, hands on steel, breath-counted eyes peering into a future measured in miles. Seattle, Washington, 9 months earlier. The Boeing plant hums with a rhythm not unlike the sky it serves. The steady percussion of rivet guns, the clatter of steel, and the smell of oil and hot aluminum. Men and women in denim coveralls move along the skeleton of a new kind of aircraft, one that would have to do the impossible, fly into hell and come back alive. In a drafting room perched above the assembly floor, Edward Curtis Wells, quiet, bespectacled and 30 years old, leans over a blueprint so large it could double as a tablecloth. The drawing is labeled in careful hand, Model 299E, Boeing Flying Fortress. Wells is not a man of speeches. He doesn't talk about destiny or patriotism. His genius lies in worry, in imagining everything that can go wrong when a 60,000-pound aircraft trades altitude for hope. Each pencil stroke on that blueprint is the product of questions no one else wants to ask. What happens when one control cable is shot through? What if a fire cuts the hydraulics? What if an engine dies 400 miles from home? He doesn't trust luck, he trusts structure. When he was still an apprentice engineer, Wells had studied the failure reports of early test models that crashed during experimental runs. One detail stayed with him. A single bullet in the wrong place could kill 10 men. That, he decided, was not engineering, that was gambling. So when the War Department asked for a long-range bomber that could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs and survive a gauntlet of enemy fire, Wells didn't dream of speed or beauty. He dreamed of resilience. He proposed something no one else at the time dared: triple redundancy in critical systems. 3 control cables, not one. 3 separate fuel tanks per wing, each sealed off from the others by armored bulkheads. If a single section was pierced, valves would automatically isolate it. Too heavy, some of his peers warned. You'll slow her down. Too complex, said others. You'll never get it past testing. But Wells had already made up his mind. You can replace speed, he said simply. You can't replace a crew. At night, he'd walk the empty factory floor and run his hand over the curved ribs of the prototype, a frame that still smelled of metal shavings and primer. He saw not a machine but a promise, the promise that if his design worked, a pilot somewhere over Europe might live to see another sunrise. When production began in earnest, the Flying Fortress took on the shape of his principles. Self-sealing fuel tanks, an innovation borrowed from experimental naval designs, were installed throughout. These tanks used layers of vulcanized rubber that would swell on contact with fuel, choking off leaks before they could ignite. Wells personally oversaw the stress tests. He stood in the observation booth as technicians fired 50 caliber rounds into the tanks. They watched as the holes bled for a moment, then stopped, the rubber sealing itself in seconds. The engineers clapped. Wells just nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion rather than celebrating a triumph. He added armor where it mattered, around the cockpit, the engines, and the fuel cells. He designed the wings to carry not just lift, but life, with hollow spars that could sustain the plane even after losing a section. To an outsider, it looked like over-engineering. To Wells, it was preparation. Still, there was skepticism. Executives in pressed suits asked whether the added cost was worth it. Wells answered without raising his voice. If one of our boys makes it home because of what's in those blueprints, that's your return on investment. The first prototypes flew in 1935. They called it the Flying Fortress, after a reporter watched a demonstration and saw machine guns bristling from its sides like a medieval castle in the clouds. But to Wells, that nickname meant something different. A fortress wasn't just about firepower. It was about endurance. By 1941, the B-17 was already being shipped overseas. Each unit carried with it the invisible fingerprints of its maker. The redundancies, the reinforcements, the self-sealing lifelines hidden beneath the aluminum skin. And though no one outside Boeing would ever read the engineer's memos or see his late-night sketches, those designs were about to be tested under the cruelest conditions imaginable. The men who would fly them didn't know Edward Wells by name. But soon, over Europe's burning skies, they would come to know his work better than any signature. And on April 8, 1943, as Captain Harlan's Fortress limped home through the shrapnel clouds of Bremen, those blueprints were keeping 10 men alive, one heartbeat at a time. The engines groaned like thunder in slow motion. Each rotation of the propellers pulled them closer to safety and closer to the edge of exhaustion. It had been 23 minutes since the flak barrage above Bremen tore into their wing. The smell inside the fuselage was a brutal mixture of fuel vapor, smoke, and sweat. Captain Harlan's gloved hands trembled on the yoke. He didn't feel fear, not exactly. It was something colder, sharper, the kind of clarity only men in falling machines can know. "Fuel lines hit on number 3, Ortiz shouted over the intercom. "Pressure's dropping! Seal it!" Harlan barked. The engineer, Corporal Lewis, reached for the shut-off valve beneath the floorboard, a lever designed from Wells's blueprints. With a twist, the flow stopped. The hiss died. The smell of fuel lessened. The self-sealing tank had done its work. Blackened rubber was already swelling around the puncture, choking the leak before it could ignite. "Leak contained," Lewis reported. "Contained." 2 years earlier, that word wouldn't have existed in a pilot's vocabulary. In most bombers of the era, one hit like that meant a fireball and a long fall home. But the Flying Fortress had rewritten those odds. Outside, Luftwaffe fighters circled, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, their sleek frames darting like wolves around a wounded elk. The gunners tensed. The right waist gunner, Private Red Lawson, squeezed the twin handles of his .50 caliber and spat fire into the gray sky. One fighter peeled away, trailing smoke. Another dove straight for them, guns blazing. The fortress shuddered again. The tail section screamed in protest. Shards of plexiglass exploded inward. Sergeant Miller, the tail gunner, wiped blood from his cheek and checked his guns. "Still working, still alive." "Tail's hit, but I'm good," he said, voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. Inside, there was no panic, only ritual. Every man knew his duty. The redundancy of the design extended into their training, into their movements. The Fortress wasn't just a machine, it was a system of belief, one built on the idea that nothing should depend on a single point of failure. Not a fuel line, not a cable, not a man. When the bombardier called out that the bomb bay fire had spread to the insulation, Captain Harlan made a choice, one that should have been impossible at that altitude. "Reed, dump the payload." The bomb bay doors creaked open with hydraulic grace. Wind tore through the fuselage like a wild animal, sucking at their clothes, clawing at the flames. The fire starved itself on oxygen and smoke. Bombs fell away, whistling toward the ruined city below, and with them went several 100 pounds of weight that might have doomed them. The fortress rose slightly, lighter now. The sky was still chaos. The radio screamed with fragments of other crews calling for help. Smoke trails marked where fortresses had gone down, bright falling comets that ended in black. "Navigator, course to the channel," Harlan said. Jensen, his hands steady as stone, plotted it out. "Bearing 240, that'll take us home." They turned west, 2 engines at full power, 1 coughing, 1 dead. Then came the silence. Not total. There was still the hum of propellers, the rattle of the fuselage, the whisper of wind through holes, but silence in the headset. The Luftwaffe fighters broke off, either low on fuel or unwilling to chase a ghost through the clouds. For the first time in an hour, the crew could breathe. Harlan finally allowed himself a look back. The floor was slick with oil. The rear fuselage looked as though someone had taken a giant bite out of it. And yet the plane held. He remembered the pre-flight briefing that morning when a mechanic had slapped the side of the plane and said, "Don't worry, sir, she'll bring you back." Now, with 400 miles still between them and their airfield, those words had become prophecy. They descended into thicker clouds. Icing built along the wings. The airspeed dropped. Ortiz feathered the dead engine, adjusting trim tabs to compensate. Every gauge seemed to whisper bad news, but the Fortress kept flying. At 12,000 feet, the clouds thinned, and the grey expanse of the English Channel appeared below. Cold, endless, beautiful. Then a new problem. "Hydraulics on landing gear are shot," Lewis called out. Harlan nodded grimly. "Manual release it is." The engineer crawled into the narrow belly passage, his body scraping against the cold steel walls. He found the emergency lever and yanked it down hard. With a scream of tortured metal, the landing gear dropped into place, half-locked, uneven, but there. "Got it!" he yelled. They crossed the coastline near Dover, trailing smoke like a banner. Ground crews spotted them from the cliffs, a crippled Fortress limping home, her belly scorched, her tail half gone, but wings level. When they finally touched down, the wheels protested, the fuselage sagged, and the right wing dipped dangerously. But she stayed upright. The plane came to rest at the end of the runway in a puff of dust and steam. Silence again. Then the laughter, ragged, relieved, half hysterical. They had made it. As the crew climbed out, medics and mechanics ran toward them. The ground chief stopped dead when he saw the holes peppering the fuselage. "Jesus," he muttered. "How in God's name did this thing stay in the air?" Captain Harlan smiled, wiping grime from his face. "You can thank the man who built her." He didn't know Edward Wells's name, but somewhere in Seattle, that engineer's design had just proven its worth in the most violent test imaginable, and word of that miracle would soon reach him. 2 weeks later, a letter crossed the Atlantic, carried not by bomber or battleship, but by courier and civilian mailbag. It was addressed simply, Mr. Edward C. Wells, Boeing Aircraft Company, Seattle, Washington. The envelope was battered, the paper inside smudged by travel. It came from the 303rd Bomb Group, stationed at Molesworth, England. Wells didn't notice it at first. His desk was buried beneath drafts and revisions, blueprints rolled into neat cylinders like artillery shells. When he did open the letter, he unfolded it slowly, the engineer's mind already half occupied by the new prototype, the B-29. The handwriting was uneven, probably written in haste. "Dear Mr. Wells, you don't know us, but we sure know your airplane. We flew her home on April 8th after losing an engine, a wing spar, and half our hydraulics over Bremen. The Germans threw everything they had at us, flak, fighters, you name it. But she didn't quit, she wouldn't quit." "Discount. We made it home because you made her right. 10 men owe you their lives. To Robert Harlan and crew, 303rd Bomb Group." Wells read it once, then again. He set it down, adjusted his glasses, and just stared at the sheet, the ink shaking slightly under the fan's breeze. He had never met these men, never stood on a flight line in England, or smelled the smoke of burning oil at altitude. But now, through those words, the miles between blueprint and battlefield vanished. That night, after most of the factory had gone quiet, Wells walked through the hangar. Rows of unfinished B-17s stood under the floodlights, bare skeletons of metal and promise. He ran his hand along the curved ribs of one, cool, solid, alive. He thought of all the small choices that had led here. The arguments over weight distribution, the late nights recalculating load-bearing stress on the wing spars, the long hours convincing military officials that redundancy wasn't waste, it was insurance. Every bolt, every wire, every drop of sealant was now part of a story written not in ink, but in survival. He looked up as the night shift came in. A dozen mechanics moving like ghosts between the frames. Sparks rained from welders, showering the floor in light. The sound was rhythmic, almost sacred. Wells smiled, not proudly but quietly, like a man who's just seen proof that hope can be engineered. In Europe, the legend of the flying fortress began to spread. Crews told stories of limping home with wings shredded, tails missing, engines torn apart, and yet somehow landing on friendly soil. Newspapers printed photos of planes with holes large enough to crawl through, accompanied by captions that seemed too unbelievable to be real. One, nicknamed All-American, returned from a mission over Tunisia with its tail nearly severed in half. Another, 909, completed 140 missions without losing a single crew member. Each story fed the myth, but behind every miracle was math, precision, and the quiet brilliance of men like Edward Wells. In one post-mission interview, a B-17 pilot summed it up best. You could hear her dying under you, feel her shake apart, but she'd always get you home. That plane had a soul, and maybe she did. Maybe her soul was made of rivets and steel and rubber, but also of foresight, the kind that asks not how fast can it go, but how far will it take them when everything goes wrong. Back at Boeing, Wells pinned Harlan's letter on the wall behind his desk. He never framed it, never mentioned it in interviews. But years later, when colleagues asked him what part of the B-17 he was proudest of, he would tap the side of a mock-up fuel tank and say, "That right there, that's the difference between a coffin and a homecoming." In the end, more than 12,000 flying fortresses were built. They dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs, flew in every theater of war, and brought tens of thousands of men home who otherwise wouldn't have made it. And through every mission, every crippled return, and every story told over whiskey and cigarette smoke in airfields across England, one truth endured. The B-17 didn't just win battles, it redefined survival. A machine that could take a beating and keep flying wasn't just a marvel of engineering. It was a message written in fire and metal that human ingenuity could stand against destruction itself. April 8, 1942 at Bremen. A single bomber flew through hell and came back, not because of luck, but because one engineer thousands of miles away refused to design a coffin.